Long History's Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. Number 36, David Lloyd George, World War I, and more. Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Long History's Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. Each week, we pick a Prime Minister using a random number generator, and this week we landed on number 36, which led us to the Prime Minister towards the second half of World War I, and who had a number of other significant achievements, placing him among some of the best Prime Ministers the country's ever seen. Now here on Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, when we've picked our Prime Minister at random, we like to ask a series of questions, including what were they like, how did they get into office, and what were their main achievements in office. And along the way we paint a picture of the times, so if you like that, please don't forget to subscribe to Long History and Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, and feel free to explore our other episodes. This is actually the 29th episode of Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, and so far we've randomly covered Prime Ministers from Robert Walpole, the very first Prime Minister, to Herbert Asquith, David Lloyd George's predecessor. So here we go with Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, David Lloyd George, who was Prime Minister between 1916 and 1922. In our exploration of random Prime Ministers, there have been many almost forgotten men in this series. Lloyd George certainly is not one of them. He's one of the few Prime Ministers whose name is automatically evoked in lists of the greatest Prime Minister ever. He's an impressive, and from the research that we've done here, a surprisingly underrated Prime Minister. In fact, although until now we've pretty much automatically assumed that Winston Churchill will have been the best Prime Minister ever, looking at Lloyd George, we can see that the case isn't quite as strong as we'd assumed. We'll look into why Lloyd George was a serious contender throughout this episode. Lloyd George was Welsh, famously Welsh through and through. Welsh was his first language. And although he was a member of the Liberal Party, one of the two main political parties at the time, he was primarily an independent spirit, a characteristic which no doubt helped him to make it to the top spot, but it would eventually count against him. He himself apparently thought that there was no friendship at the top of politics. He was a huge character, overshadowing his colleagues and seen as a titan even during his lifetime, not least when he lapped up the praise for having played his part in winning the First World War. The historian A.J.P. Taylor, in one of his biographical essays, stated that although Lloyd George saw himself as a man of the people, it wasn't in the sense of representing an organised working class, but rather he saw himself representing the ordinary shopkeeper, someone like his own uncle, the man who brought him up. He was married to Margaret Owen, but she remained back in Wales while he lived in London and enjoyed London's life. He was a bit of a womaniser, and when his first wife died, he married his long-term mistress just 2 years before he himself died. What was the historical background? Well, we're talking about the era from 1916 to 1922 here, an era dominated by the First World War and the Spanish flu epidemic afterwards, of course. And just before that, there had been the Edwardian era, which had been something of an Indian summer for the English, the last gasp of a certain type of life when the British Empire seemed to be holding strong and the Industrial Revolution still appeared to be in full swing. The First World War brought all that crashing down. But Lloyd George's predecessor, Herbert Asquith, had been very much a man of that former era. By the 6th of December 1916, the Great War had been underway almost 2.5 years, and something of a stalemate had emerged. On the 1st of July the previous summer, almost 20,000 British soldiers had been killed in just one day, so it was a very bloody stalemate. The First World War wasn't the only issue. The Easter Rising in Ireland in 1916, where the Irish Republicans rose against British rule in Ireland, took place around 6 months before Lloyd George took office, putting the issue of Irish independence squarely on the table, an issue that Lloyd George would attempt to deal with after the First World War. But those weren't the only battles. This was a very tumultuous time with the Russian Revolution beginning in March 1917. What was happening in the US at the time? Woodrow Wilson was president during most of Lloyd George's time in office, with Warren G. Harding being in the job for the last year of his premiership. Arizona had joined the Union just 4 years before Lloyd George became Prime Minister, with the US entering into the First World War on the 6th of April 1917, just after the Russian Revolution began. At this point it seemed that the Germans were gaining the upper hand, and the latest developments convinced the US to put its neutrality to one side. As we'll see, Lloyd George only became Prime Minister as a result of the coalitions that were formed during and after the First World War. During his early years as an MP, Lloyd George hadn't supported votes for women. However, during the war, women had taken over many of the roles traditionally done by men in the UK. Partly as a form of reward, women over the age of 30, who were householders, graduates or paid rent over £5 a year, were given the right to vote in November 1918. Now this happened during Lloyd George's premiership, but it doesn't seem to have been linked to Lloyd George very directly. And full suffrage, with women voting on equal terms with men, wouldn't come till 1928. The same act, the Representation of the People Act of 1918, would also give voting rights to all men over 21 for the first time. So these were very much times of reform, and Lloyd George was at the centre of them, although he doesn't appear to take credit for women being given the vote. What was David Lloyd George's background? This is the 29th Prime Minister we've randomly looked at so far in Long History's random UK Prime Minister of the Week. Of those men and women, until Lloyd George, only one had a claim to be a truly working class person, Ramsay MacDonald. He was the first Labour Party Prime Minister, who was in the top job in the 1920s and 30s, just after Lloyd George but not directly after. And there are distinct parallels between the two men's backgrounds. They were both working class, and whereas Ramsay MacDonald was brought up in Scotland, Lloyd George, although he was born in Manchester, was brought up in Wales. He's the only Welsh Prime Minister we've had so far. But it is striking how, like Ramsay MacDonald, by not being from England, he somehow managed to circumvent the English class system and make his way to the top, not least showing how England benefits from this political union. And whereas Ramsay MacDonald was a member of the Labour Party, a party created directly for the working class, although perhaps such a statement will always be arguable, Lloyd George, despite this not dissimilar background, didn't have the backing of a party of the working class to help him rise to the top. This actually makes his rise all the more impressive. He was born on the 17th of January 1863, and his birth name was actually David George, but his father died soon after he was born, and so he was brought up by his mother in his uncle's house, his uncle being Richard Lloyd. David George therefore took on his uncle's surname. He was educated at local schools and had tutors, and was actually one of the very few prime ministers not to go to university. Nevertheless, at the age of 21, Lloyd George qualified as a solicitor and became the MP for Carnarvon in 1890. Then he was about 27 years old. He famously opposed the Boer Wars, the wars where the British fought against the Boer republics in South Africa. Lloyd George, and this wasn't the only time, supported the smaller of the nations in this international dispute, particularly during the Second Boer War of 1899 to 1902. In 1905, Henry Campbell Bannerman rose to the premiership in charge of the Liberal Party, and Lloyd George, as a member of that party, entered the cabinet for the first time as the president of the Board of Trade. Campbell Bannerman's time in office was relatively brief because he fell ill and then quickly died after resigning. He passed the role on to Herbert Asquith. In turn, Lloyd George would become the Chancellor of the Exchequer for Asquith, a role which, as listeners to other episodes will have noted, not infrequently leads to the top job itself. Speaking of which, how did Lloyd George become Prime Minister? Lloyd George famously opposed British participation in the First World War at first, but then when the Germans invaded Belgium, he changed his mind, once again defending the smaller nation against a larger one. Asquith, Lloyd George's predecessor, had been a very successful Prime Minister before the war, but he was very much a laid-back Edwardian, a man of the old school. When action was needed, he made Lloyd George Minister of Munitions, and Lloyd George proved a man of action, significantly increasing output in a role which would eventually lead to him taking over from Asquith. He'd excelled in his job and proved a man of action, a war leader, as opposed to Asquith's rather lugubrious and laid-back style. Lloyd George took office on the 6th of December 1916, in charge of a newly formed coalition government, which effectively pushed Asquith out of office during this time of national need. Note, however, that this coalition was between Lloyd George's Liberals and the Conservative Party, Herbert Asquith's Liberals staying out of it and becoming the opposition. What were Lloyd George's principal achievements as Prime Minister? And now we come to the reasons why Lloyd George is a candidate for the best Prime Minister ever. Of course, he's famous as the World War I Prime Minister, just as Churchill is famous for World War II. However, before he even became Prime Minister, Lloyd George also helped to lay the foundations for the welfare state as part of one of the UK's most reformist governments ever, and particularly part of the government of that successful predecessor, Herbert Asquith. Lloyd George was involved in the introduction of the first pensions in the UK, and also the earliest forms of national insurance and unemployment benefit. Such actions would lead to a marked reduction in so-called paupers. The numbers of the very poor reduced from 920,000 to 750,000 between 1910 and 1914. I'm not sure how many prime ministers can be said to have improved people's lives so directly. That was before he was Prime Minister, however. When he did take up the job, the First World War had been raging for 2.5 years, and that stalemate was in place. Of course, there's little to celebrate at all about a war, but Lloyd George brought about a new sense of purpose, centralising authority and introducing rationing to help with food shortages. When the war eventually ended, he took a great deal of the credit. In the episode on Churchill, we described how, after winning the war, the public, rather than rewarding him with an election victory, in fact gave victory to the opposition and threw Churchill out of office. Lloyd George was given similar credit for his victory in World War I, but he did survive his post-war election, and this in fact could be the reason why his reputation is not quite so stratospheric as his fellow war-winning Prime Minister. Lloyd George continued in office, and he was in fact involved in another major development for the UK. The issue of Irish Home Rule had been live for decades, in fact centuries. Lloyd George, looking for another cause after World War I, tried to settle the issue once and for all, and this would lead to the division of Ireland, including the independent Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, which would remain in the UK. This was the result of many protests, uprising and battles by the Irish against the English over the years. But it isn't as if suddenly Lloyd George granted them independence, but this definitely was an existential development for the UK. It lost a significant part of the territory it had previously claimed, legitimately or illegitimately, and a new independent country was created. It was a hugely consequential development, although the issue, of course, was still far from settled. Why did Lloyd George stop being Prime Minister? As stated, after the First World War, Lloyd George won the 1918 general election. However, it was with the same coalition that he'd headed when he became a war leader. This coalition mainly involved the Conservative Party, who should have been Lloyd George's enemies, together with the members of the Liberal Party who had joined the coalition with Lloyd George. As we've stated, the other Liberal Party members stayed with Asquith in the remains of the Liberal Party, the opposition. However, this was a move that almost killed off the Liberal Party altogether, and certainly, at least politically, left it on life support for almost a century. So Lloyd George's government after the war depended on the support of the Conservative Party. Lloyd George found one cause with the Irish dispute, but then he moved his sights to another issue in Turkey. Lloyd George saw another cause to fight for, another potential world war, and people at that point just didn't want another war. The Conservatives got together and voted to end the coalition. They won the next general election, and Lloyd George was effectively thrown into the political wilderness. Perhaps because of all these political manoeuvrings, and the two main parties, the Conservatives and the Liberals, were so concerned with their own disputes, they didn't even notice, as a political party that focused on working people rather than political opponents emerged, and would soon take over from the Liberal Party as one of the two main political parties, in the form of the Labour Party, headed by that other working class outlier, the aforementioned Ramsay MacDonald. And unlike MacDonald, who died soon after leaving the job of Prime Minister, Lloyd George was a very influential figure for many years, until his death just before the end of the Second World War. His independent streak, however, meant that he had few allies strong enough to help him return to the front line of politics. He took part in the debates that would eventually lead to Chamberlain being replaced by Churchill early on in the Second World War, but surprisingly for a successful war leader, he seemed to want to stay out of the Second World War. One commentator stating that he wanted to wait until he could run the whole affair. Lloyd George's last vote in 1943 was in support of the Beveridge Report, which would eventually lead to the establishment of the NHS, whose foundations Lloyd George had put in place. So why should we remember David Lloyd George? And at this stage there's another question actually. Why isn't Lloyd George quite so well renowned as Churchill? As stated, whereas Churchill left the room as the Second World War ended, Lloyd George stayed around and increasingly became accused of cynicism, not least when it was found that he was selling peerages, meaning that someone could pay, say, £10,000 to become a knight. The proceeds of this sale apparently went to his own party funds, and it wasn't illegal at the time, but it increased that sense of a man who wasn't willing to play by the spirit of the rules. He'd always been a bit of a maverick, a liberal in a conservative coalition, and now his lack of loyalty, or his independence as we could also see it, worked against him. After the First World War, there was no longer a need for a war leader. There was more of a need for a politician in the bureaucratic sense. Churchill avoided that period by stepping away from the front line for a time, but Lloyd George stayed around, not least to witness the last gasp of the Liberal Party, whose demise as a political force he had a large part in. In this way, he came to be seen as untrustworthy, as a destroyer of parties, a bit of a wrecking ball of a politician, when, after a war, the people wanted a break from such drama. He did return to the Liberal Party, but this was just as the Labour Party began to rise to power. Unfortunately, also during the early days of Hitler's rule, he also made the misstep of coming out in support of him. According to the historian A.J.P. Taylor, there was something of a paradox in Lloyd George. Despite his effectiveness, he was a disliked and distrusted figure, because he was a maverick and he was seen as unpredictable. He was inconsistent and he was an improviser. Apparently he existed outside the establishment, and not long after the war was over, according to A.J.P. Taylor's assessment, the establishment made sure he didn't return to power again. Ultimately, he was a Welshman from a small village, whereas Churchill was the Duke of Marlborough's grandson. So Lloyd George's life is all the more remarkable because of that Welsh background. Many prime ministers seem to have been almost gifted with the job, but this was very much not the case with Lloyd George, who got there through talent, passion and persistence. Churchill won a war. Lloyd George also won a war, but he also set the foundations of the welfare state, and he also came up with a way to move the Irish debate on in a fundamental way, leading to an existential change for both Ireland and the newly defined UK. That's a pretty good record. Thank you everyone for listening to this episode of Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. As always, there are many contentious and controversial issues here, so please just see this as an introduction so that you can dig into this history a little deeper and challenge the version of events here and come up with your own better history. Thank you everyone for listening to Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, number 36, David Lloyd George, World War I and more. Goodbye.